What if I told you that every time you justify yourself, explain your actions, or defend your decisions, you're actually making yourself weaker? That the very act of justification is a sign of vulnerability that others will exploit to control and manipulate you. Niccolò Machiavelli, the master strategist who advised princes and shaped the course of history, discovered a psychological principle so powerful that it can make you virtually untouchable in any social or professional situation. The moment you justify yourself, you hand over your power to whoever is questioning you. You put them in the position of judge and yourself in the position of defendant. You signal that their approval matters more than your own judgment. And once you start this dance, you've already lost the game. Machiavelli understood something that modern psychology has now confirmed. Justification is not about truth or fairness. It's about power dynamics. When someone demands that you explain yourself, they're not seeking understanding. They're testing your resolve, probing for weakness, and establishing dominance. The person who feels compelled to justify is the person who can be controlled. This isn't just ancient political strategy. This is cutting-edge social psychology. Dr. Robert Cialdini's research on influence reveals that people who constantly justify their actions are perceived as less confident and less competent. Dr. Amy Cuddy's work on presence shows that those who explain themselves excessively are seen as lacking authority and conviction. Every justification weakens your position and invites further challenges. Think about the most powerful people you know, the ones who command respect effortlessly. Do they spend time explaining their decisions to everyone who questions them? Do they feel compelled to justify their choices to people who have no stake in the outcome? Of course not. They understand what Machiavelli knew. Explanation is often manipulation in disguise. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote that a ruler must be both feared and loved, but if you have to choose, it's better to be feared. But this doesn't mean being tyrannical or cruel. It means being someone whose decisions are final, whose word carries weight, whose judgment doesn't require external validation. When you stop justifying yourself, you automatically become more formidable. The compulsion to justify comes from what psychologists call approval-seeking behavior. The unconscious drive to maintain social acceptance by explaining away anything that might be perceived as wrong or questionable. But Machiavelli understood that this very drive makes you predictable, manipulable, and ultimately weak. The person who needs constant approval can never make difficult but necessary decisions. Modern neuroscience explains why justification is so psychologically damaging. When you engage in defensive explanations, you activate your brain's threat detection system. Your amygdala fires, your stress hormones spike, and your cognitive resources shift from executive function to survival mode. You literally become less intelligent and less capable when you're in justification mode. But here's what makes this truly powerful. When you refuse to justify yourself unnecessarily, you force others to accept your reality rather than imposing theirs on you. You shift the dynamic from reactive to proactive, from defensive to authoritative. You become someone whose decisions matter because you act like they matter. This doesn't mean being rude, dismissive, or unaccountable. Machiavelli was sophisticated enough to understand that different situations require different approaches. There's a crucial difference between being accountable to legitimate authority and justifying yourself to every person who questions your choices. The key is knowing when explanation serves your interests and when it undermines them. Accountability is about taking responsibility for results and consequences. Justification is about seeking permission for your choices from people who have no right to grant or deny that permission. Machiavelli would have said that a wise leader accepts responsibility for outcomes while refusing to subject their decision-making process to the judgment of those who lack the information, authority, or competence to evaluate it properly. The most insidious form of justification is what psychologists call emotional labor. the exhausting work of managing other people's feelings about your choices. When you constantly explain your decisions to make others comfortable, you're essentially allowing them to veto your life. You're giving them power over your actions without them having to take any responsibility for the consequences. Machiavelli observed that people respect strength and consistency more than they respect niceness and accommodation. When you stop justifying yourself, you may initially encounter resistance from people who are used to questioning your authority. But over time, they learn to respect your boundaries and seek your approval rather than the other way around. The practice begins with small things. When someone asks why you made a particular choice that doesn't affect them, instead of launching into an explanation, simply say, "It worked for my situation." When someone questions your priorities, instead of defending them, say, "I'm comfortable with my decision." When someone challenges your methods, instead of justifying them, say, "I'll take responsibility for the results." This isn't about being arrogant or closed-minded. It's about maintaining your psychological sovereignty. Machiavelli understood that every time you submit your judgment to someone else's approval, you weaken your capacity to act decisively when it matters. You train yourself to second-guess your instincts and seek permission for choices that should be yours alone. The most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, and innovators throughout history have understood this principle intuitively. They make decisions based on their best judgment, take responsibility for the outcomes, and refuse to be paralyzed by the need to justify every choice to every stakeholder. They understand that consensus seeking often leads to mediocrity, and that true leadership sometimes requires making unpopular decisions without apology. But there's a deeper psychological principle at work here. When you stop justifying yourself, you force yourself to make better decisions. If you know you won't be able to hide behind elaborate explanations, you become more thoughtful about your choices. You develop what Machiavelli called prudence, the ability to make sound judgments based on incomplete information without second-guessing yourself into paralysis. The transformation from justifier to authority happens through what Machiavelli called the cultivation of mystery. When you stop explaining every decision, you become less predictable and therefore more powerful. People can't manipulate what they can't fully understand, and they can't challenge what isn't presented for debate. This principle operates at the deepest levels of human psychology.
If this video is making sense to you, remember to subscribe to the channel. It helps us get better with every video.
Daniel Kahneman's research on cognitive biases shows that people fill in gaps in information with assumptions that usually favor the person who appears confident and self-assured. When you refuse to over-explain, others unconsciously assume you have good reasons for your actions, even if they don't know what those reasons are. The key insight is that explanation often weakens the very thing you're trying to strengthen. When you justify a decision extensively, you signal that the decision is questionable. When you defend your choices passionately, you suggest that they might be indefensible. Machiavelli understood that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. This is particularly crucial in professional environments where over-explanation can destroy your credibility. Research by Harvard Business School professor Amy Edmondson shows that leaders who constantly justify their decisions are seen as less competent by their teams. The expectation that you should explain every choice to every stakeholder is actually a trap that keeps you in a subordinate position. But Machiavelli's strategy goes deeper than just refusing to explain. It involves what he called strategic ambiguity, the deliberate cultivation of an image that keeps others guessing about your true capabilities and intentions. When people can't fully predict your responses, they treat you with greater caution and respect. Think about the most effective negotiators you've encountered. They don't reveal their entire thought process or justify every move. They make strategic disclosures while maintaining an aura of competence and control. They understand that mystery creates leverage, while transparency often eliminates it. The practice of non-justification must be balanced with what Machiavelli called prudent communication. This means knowing when to provide information and when to withhold it, when to engage in dialogue and when to simply state your position and move forward. The goal isn't to be secretive or manipulative, but to maintain your psychological and strategic advantage. One of the most powerful applications of this principle is in personal relationships. When you stop justifying your boundaries, your needs, or your preferences to people who should respect them automatically, you transform the entire dynamic. Instead of negotiating for basic respect, you simply expect it. Instead of defending your right to make certain choices, you exercise that right without apology. This doesn't mean being inflexible or refusing to consider other perspectives. It means distinguishing between situations where explanation serves a purpose and situations where it merely feeds other people's need to control or judge you. Machiavelli would have said that wisdom lies in knowing the difference. The psychological mechanism behind this strategy involves what researchers call cognitive dissonance. When you don't provide justifications that others can pick apart, they're forced to either accept your decision or create their own explanations. Most people, faced with confident certainty, will choose acceptance over confrontation, especially when they realize that challenging you won't result in the defensive responses they're used to exploiting. Modern influence research confirms Machiavelli's insights about the power of non-justification. Dr. Robert Cialdini's studies show that people are more likely to comply with requests that are stated with authority rather than those that are hedged with excessive explanations. When you say, "This is what we're doing," instead of, "I think maybe we should consider doing this because," you dramatically increase your influence. The practice begins with recognizing the difference between legitimate requests for information and fishing expeditions designed to undermine your authority. When your boss asks for a project update, that's accountability. When a colleague questions your methodology in front of others to make themselves look smart, that's a power play. Machiavelli would have handled these situations very differently. For legitimate accountability, provide clear, factual information without defensive elaboration. For power plays, use what Machiavelli called the redirect. Acknowledge the question without answering it directly, then shift the conversation to more productive territory. That's an interesting point. What I'm focused on is delivering results by the deadline. The most sophisticated aspect of this strategy involves what Machiavelli called controlled revelation. Instead of justifying your past decisions, you reveal your future intentions strategically. Instead of explaining why you did something, you communicate what you're going to do next. This shifts the conversation from judgment of your past to anticipation of your future actions. Personal boundaries become much stronger when you stop justifying them. Instead of explaining why you can't work late, you simply say you're not available. Instead of defending your personal time, you protect it without apology. Instead of justifying your relationships, career choices, or lifestyle decisions to people who aren't affected by them, you simply live your life according to your own judgment. The resistance you'll initially encounter when you stop justifying yourself is actually a sign that the strategy is working. People who are used to questioning your authority, pushing your boundaries, or manipulating you through guilt and pressure will escalate their tactics when their usual methods stop working. Machiavelli called this the test of resolve, and passing it transforms your entire social dynamic. The mastery of non-justification requires what Machiavelli called inner fortitude, the psychological strength to remain unmoved by others' attempts to make you doubt your judgment. This isn't stubbornness or closed-mindedness. It's the cultivated ability to distinguish between valuable feedback and manipulative pressure, between legitimate concerns and power games. The most advanced practitioners of this strategy develop what Machiavelli termed selective transparency. They choose precisely when and how much to reveal based on strategic considerations rather than emotional reactions. They understand that information is power, and they distribute it deliberately rather than reflexively. This selective approach transforms your relationships from reactive dynamics to proactive ones. Instead of constantly defending your choices, you become someone whose choices shape the conversation. Instead of being put on trial by every person who questions you, you maintain the position of authority over your own life and decisions. The business world provides countless examples of this principle in action. Steve Jobs famously refused to justify Apple's design decisions to critics and market researchers. He understood that innovation requires making choices that can't be fully explained until their success becomes obvious. Jeff Bezos built Amazon by making long-term decisions that he refused to justify to quarterly-focused shareholders. Warren Buffett invests according to his own criteria regardless of popular opinion or pressure to explain his reasoning. These leaders understand that justification is often the enemy of excellence. When you're constantly explaining your choices to people who lack your expertise, information, or vision, you inevitably water down your decisions to accommodate their limited understanding. You optimize for explanation rather than results. The psychological transformation that occurs when you stop justifying yourself is profound. You develop what Machiavelli called sprezzatura, the appearance of effortless competence that comes from not needing external validation for your choices. You become someone who acts from internal conviction rather than external pressure. This inner shift affects every aspect of your life. Your decision-making becomes cleaner because you're not constantly second-guessing yourself based on imagined criticism. Your relationships become healthier because you stop allowing others to micromanage your choices. Your professional life becomes more effective because you focus on results rather than consensus. The practice of non-justification also protects you from what psychologists call analysis paralysis, the tendency to overthink decisions to the point of inaction. When you know you won't have to justify every aspect of your choice, you become more comfortable making decisions with incomplete information and adjusting course as needed. Machiavelli understood that in a world of competing interests and limited information, the person who waits for perfect justification will never act decisively. The person who acts decisively and takes responsibility for outcomes will ultimately be more successful than the person who can perfectly explain why they didn't act at all. The ultimate test of this strategy comes during crises when everyone wants explanations, justifications, and someone to blame. This is when non-justification becomes most powerful and most difficult. The person who can maintain their composure, make necessary decisions, and refuse to be drawn into defensive explanations often emerges as the natural leader others look to for direction. But perhaps the most important aspect of Machiavelli's strategy is what he called the cultivation of respect through mystery. When you stop over-explaining yourself, people begin to assume you have good reasons for your actions, even when they don't know what those reasons are. They start giving you the benefit of the doubt, rather than assuming the worst about your motivations. This doesn't happen overnight. It requires consistent practice and the willingness to tolerate initial discomfort as people adjust to your new boundaries. But the long-term payoff is immense. You become someone whose word carries weight, whose decisions are taken seriously, and whose judgment is trusted rather than constantly questioned. The final element of mastery involves knowing when to break your own rule. True sophistication means understanding that strategic justification can sometimes serve your interests better than silence. When explaining your reasoning will build trust, prevent misunderstandings, or demonstrate your competence to people whose opinion matters, explanation becomes a tool rather than a weakness. The key is that this explanation comes from choice rather than compulsion, from strategy rather than insecurity. You explain because it serves your purposes, not because you feel pressured to defend yourself. You maintain control over when, how, and to whom you provide justification. Machiavelli's ultimate insight was that power flows to those who act like they deserve it. When you stop justifying your right to make decisions, you implicitly claim that right. When you stop defending your choices, you signal that they don't require defense. When you stop seeking permission through explanation, you demonstrate that you don't need permission. This is how you become untouchable, not through aggression or manipulation, but through the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own mind and trusting your own judgment. You become someone who shapes reality rather than constantly explaining why reality should accommodate you. The choice is yours. Continue justifying yourself to everyone who questions you, or begin the practice of strategic non-justification that transforms you from supplicant to authority. In a world full of people seeking approval, the person who doesn't need it becomes magnetic, powerful, and ultimately untouchable.